So for example, you asked me when we started, I don't know if it was recorded, how do I feel today? And I said I felt sad. And part of the reason I was feeling sad was I was thinking about childhood stuff and where I am and where I've not achieved. I was thinking about what I learned about you and your story and this learning project story. And it was kind of making me sad. And that's okay. You have to feel it's okay to enter into weakness. It's like if you want to build strength in a muscle, you have to work on it. If you've got poor lower body strength and great upper body strength, if you only worked on upper body strength, then you'd never get lower body strength. So that's the way I think of it. To be a rounded individual means working on all kinds of strengths. And a lot of them are, I don't know, it's not a simple answer. Some things just don't taste good. But if you don't try them, you may.
Today, we're going to speak with Dr. Lincoln Stoller. He is an author, a physicist, a psychotherapist, a hypnotherapist, an EEG biofeedback therapist, and the list goes on, folks. Lincoln, could you please introduce yourself? Let people know just a little bit about you, please.
Thanks. I'm really glad to talk to you, and I can't tell you too much about myself beyond what you said, except that maybe I never get along with any group I'm in. I guess I'm a really slow learner. I'm 66 or something, and I've been involved in all these projects, degrees, and areas of social interaction, and my basic approach is to go back to sort of innocence. Now, we'll talk about this project when we get there, but I've always felt that a childhood view, a child's-like view of the world is more rich than what we call an adult view. And I was thinking about this morning. I think that's because I think children are more emotionally exposed. They expose themselves emotionally, they interact emotionally, and they're sensitive emotionally. And as adults, we get really calloused. And I think we lose, maybe just because we need to protect ourselves. But I think that attitude, it always does me well in terms of my understanding, but in terms of groups, most people don't appreciate it. Most people think they think lesser of kids and childhood innocence and stuff. So as a scientist, I'm always asking the uncomfortable questions, the obvious questions, like, what the hell does this all mean? And everybody thinks, well, you should know that now, right? And so I tend to get thrown out of these groups. Almost every group I'm in, I feel I'm not getting the most childhood answer, if you will. Anyhow, so I got into therapy after many years in physics and computers and business. And I find it one of the more rewarding places, because now I do get to answer. And I don't answer, but I certainly get to ask the questions about childhood and what does it mean? And people work at that answer with me. You don't get that in business. where everything's goal directed and material,
Yeah.
or science either, really. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where I am working at. Picasso had a great quote. He said it like, it took me a lifetime to learn to paint, and no, he said it took me years to learn to paint and a lifetime to learn to become a child again. And so,
Yeah.
we talk about the learning project, but that's my introduction.
Yeah. Well, Lincoln, it's fascinating, the learning project. It's a book that carries you through stages of life, and it explores life through the lenses of individuals and different people. You've got individuals like Oliver, that was a dropout, and he aspires to be a film producer. And then you've got, on the other end of the spectrum, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And everybody should recognize who that is. That's a good scope. It's a good range. And you've got, in the elderly class, some fascinating individuals that have life lessons that have learned. It's interesting when we speak with people and learn what they've experienced. A lot of us close ourselves off to other people's experiences, which I feel is so harming to ourself, because really life, I find, is to be about connection, understanding others, and diving into those hard topics and finding the truth of a child. That is really the key. When you find truth, and no matter where it takes you, own up to it, that is really the spark of life. That is when you find your worth, your value, and so much more. Take us through what the experience was writing the book, but much more so interviewing the individuals and getting to know what the individuals truly were like.
So the project was something I started when I was 40 maybe, and I never felt I'd answered the question of what learning was about. I mean, it's a kind of nondescript question, and I wanted to. I reflected that I'd met a bunch of interesting people. Some were mentors, and some were assholes, really. But even so, they leave they leave footprints in my mind.
That's right.
So I wanted to go back, well, not to the assholes, but I did want to go back to the people I felt really knew something that I might have missed, and ask them questions I never asked them, like, what's life about? Because I've been in their, realm in some particular goal as a physicist or student or something or other. And so I kind of made a list of the people that were mentored me. And I said, I'm going to go back to these people and ask them these bigger questions, these deeper, more personal questions. And I basically reduced the question to, what did you learn? Why did you learn it? And what did it do for you? What's the process of your growing up? And, you ask this to a person who's 95, you're going to get a very different answer than if you ask it to a person who's 15. And so I was, I have a good recollection of my childhood. Well, not like, photographic or anything, but I haven't connected to it. You get into the family reasons for that. So I have a certain respect for childhood and, my insights as a child, or the questions that still are in my mind. So this project, I conceived of this project as of asking this question, not just to my mentors. That's what people usually do. They go to the famous people or the rich people or the successful people. But I wanted to go to kids, and especially kids who I really thought were really bright, or I don't mean like, successful in school. I mean, just, bright kids, like Tom Sawyer kind of kids, or Huckleberry Finn type kids. and ask them this question, and ask older people this question, and ask middle-aged people, the kind of real go-getter, ascending star type people. And then I thought, this is the scientist in me. I thought, well, maybe it differs according to what their interests are. So I'm going to ask a dozen different interests. And, that means scientists, filmmakers, biologists, writers, actors. I thought I'd interview musicians too. It turns out musicians don't talk that well. It's not their mode,
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I just didn't find a lot, although I knew a few, but couldn't sort of get those gears going. So I did artists instead. And so I wrote this book, the 33 or 35 interviews in 11 different subjects with roughly 3 different people in each subject, an old person, a young person, and a middle-aged person. And I found these people, the old people were the ones I knew mostly, found a few new ones. And the young ones, I had to look around for my kids' classmates and friends, children. And the middle-aged people, I kind of reached out for in subjects that I thought, because we know some of these characters. One of the people I interviewed is Esther Dyson, who's really well known in the computer industry as a journalist. And I didn't know her at all before that. And I found it really interesting, both because I was able to go back to people I knew and ask questions that I suspected were important, and to meet people I didn't know and have no idea how they'd respond. Well, I mean, sometimes I had some bad interviews, not bad, but, not really fertile. And those interviews didn't make it into the book. But most of the time, I was pretty blown away. And people were too. People said, nobody ever asked me these questions before. I mean, who sits down and asks you, how has your soul grown? I mean, you'd sort of laugh at that, or you'd think it was private. Or the young people said, their friends didn't talk like this. And some of the old people said, well, I've answered this question before, so I'll read from my biography. And, that's okay. So that's what the book is. It's these interviews asking this basically one question to a whole bunch of people. And I think it's important to say that they're not all normal. Some of them are struggling or have struggled, either economically or with mental illness or physical disabilities. And culturally, they're kind of all over the spectrum. Gender-wise, it's interesting. A bunch of gay people, indigenous, Asian, black, white, from all over the U.S. mostly. And as you said, I divided it in ways. Well, so it is a book that you can buy and you get a printed format, but it's also online for free, where you can rearrange the interviews by age or topic, or mostly age or topic, or just at random. And as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I didn't want to put my imprint on this whole thing, to make it my vision. I didn't want these people to endorse what I said. So I didn't distill them. I didn't summarize, and I didn't do much editing, except to, make it clear and direct. And most people who look at it will find it like a forest with not any clear path through it to answer that question of what's important in your life and what did you get from pursuing it. I mean, it's a kind of biblical question, or religious almost. And I didn't want to be, an apostle. I felt these were my apostles, these people. And I was just here to record them. So in the end, I feel it's worth mentioning in the end. The thing that most came out was the need to love yourself. And when I got that message, which was most clearly given to me by a gay, Black, academic woman, I went back and I could hear it in everybody. Not everybody said it. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure anybody really said it except she. But you could see that when they confronted obstacles, that it was their faith in themselves that carried them through rough water. And some of the water was horrendously rough. I mean, there was one woman had a mother who had what's called Munchausen's syndrome by proxy, which is when your mother tries to poison you to death repeatedly. And you can just imagine what that does to you. I mean, that's like worse than being made into a child soldier. I think it's because you're vulnerable and you're constantly under attack by the people that you depend on. And it's hard to understand their stories sometimes. But there's a great deal of clarity too, because they've climbed out of something that you hope never to fall into. So that's the scope of the book. It's not a book with the usual plot of building characters and tension in the plot and epiphany and resolution. So people either ignore the book or they're blown away by it. And
yeah, it's more of a discovery process then.
It is. And we'll mention it again because I think readers, like I say, it's free online. And I enjoyed making that online hypertext version with its navigational fluidity,
Yeah. Yeah, it's awesome. And you get into it and start reading it. It's like, wow, it seems like you've been there before. So it's really interesting. And the life stage portion of it, advancing through the life and discovering how different, but yet have the same focal point. We think different, but we have the same focal points basically through our lifespan. And you mentioned it earlier that, as we grow older, there's like a decay in our emotions, our vulnerabilities, our ability to accept what is. We have to kind of skirt it with all of this dirt and whatever else garbage we can throw on top of it. So I'm interested in finding out more about that. Did you see a pattern of decay in the attitude of individuals over time based on what actually happened in their life? I know I came from a pretty bad background where I had things happen where most people, I don't know how they would have handled it, but I find it as a learning process, and I came out of it and I understand I wasn't in control of what my life was, and I couldn't put the boundaries that I needed to on that portion of my life, where in middle age, I'm able to do that. And I can structure my life more in a meaningful way that I see right, where my influence that I was raised with had no clear objective. All they wanted was booze, party, and, had no clear focus of what life truly is. It didn't really hit me until maybe my mid 30s, early 40s. And then I started really, wow, I'm wasting my life away. Did you see that discovery process through these interviews that you did through the different people?
I think that was one of the most interesting things. I didn't really know what I'd get. You try to plot your path before you go there and you think about your own history and where it's leading you, and then you jump into a project like this where you're going to ask other people, and you have some expectation, even if you're hesitant to override their vision. But I was really interested to see what emerged. I mean, clearly, I'm picking people. These aren't average people. They're people who either have done something interesting or seem like they'll be interesting or were important in my life in the past. And I did want to split the interviews into these 3 age groups, which I did, and you can do that fairly easily, even in the printed book, because everything's labeled. And the older people, I mean, this is my summary. The older people sort of had a biography written. Their interaction with the world and the choices they made defined who they were and how they presented themselves. They were more or less well put together. But I would say also that the most creative of them were the least rigid. They were open-minded, they were chaotic, anarchistic almost, self-deprecating, because they didn't have anything to prove at this point. They were, notable and successful in their own ways. It's interesting that you bring up Neil, because Neil is one of the more organized people. I mean, that's why he's good as a journalist and as a spokesperson. He's not the kind of creative artist that turns people off. There's a lot of creative artists. Almost every creative artist I can think of has gone through a period where people don't know what the hell they're doing.
Yeah, that's right.
And they kind of drop their whole fan base. But Neil has always been very directed toward building a character as a spokesperson. And that is what he is now. He's the sort of the spokesperson for science. And so you can appreciate that that's good and bad, depending on what the topic and your goal is. And so in this case, where I asked him a direct question, he gave me direct answers, but he's also still in touch with his enthusiasm, his childhood, and his inspiration. And I think that's really a very important part of his presentation. But he's what I would consider a middle-aged person. So the older people are different. And they're very, I love reading and interviewing older people. We're talking about, really old people, sort of near end of life, the ones that really don't give a shit anymore.
Yeah.
They don't even say that, because they don't even care about not giving a shit anymore. It's just like they've got a half a foot, or they've got a foot in some other world already. And a lot of these people did pass on not long after I interviewed them. They were already stepping out of their, social personality into, the infinity of time. And then so they give some great stories, and they connect, like this one guy who was Clarence C., who I just I didn't know he was so interesting. He was just an aircraft mechanic, but he went back to the Civil War, and he said, my character was built for my grandfather, who was a barn builder in the Civil War. And here I am talking to somebody who's telling me what it's like to grow up in 1850. And, we think it's just a historical question, but it's a totally different culture. The way that people lived on horses and the way there was no machines. And it's like, that's beautiful to have that brought into the current day and what it does to a person's development. And then the middle-aged people were kind of more what you'd expect. They're culturally engaged with our culture and our needs, and they're working their way up whatever ladder they're on professionally. They tend to sound almost gladiatorial, like they're fighters or they're go-getters, and there can be less emotion in their stories because they're much more material and practical and pragmatic. Um, and But not always. Sometimes there's some incredible subtlety. I really love my friend Tom Kellogg, who is a excavator, but he's got some physical disability. It's not clear what it is, some sort of nerve thing, and he likes to work alone, and he's very enthusiastic, and he's totally positive. I mean, you could call him. He could be a disabled person, but he'd be the last person to bother with that. He just like it's just like
That's right.
whatever. He's a inspiring person, and he's totally positive. He's like more positive than you can. He's got like positive stuff in reserve that if you start poking at his personality, he'll just start laughing, and he'll get you laughing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that's cool.
Kind of enlightened. And then the young people were beautiful too. I picked interesting young people, but not entirely what you'd call. Oh, well, I did pick a few of them who were like successful academic. I went to a school for gifted kids in Georgia and interviewed a bunch. But even so, they've got real lives with real problems that real adolescents encounter, and their gift might often be just that they speak well and they think clearly. Not necessarily they're gifted in you know easy lives. And another one of my favorite. Oh well, yeah. So in the art area, of course, you get the most chaotic people, and the the first person in the book, the young person who I put in the category of art, was basically a juvenile delinquent, and
Yeah.
I didn't expect to interview him. I was visiting his father for some other reason, who's a sort of leading medical doctor in Los Angeles, and I met this kid at the pool and started asking about his story, and it was just so, I don't know. I mean, you can imagine somebody who's a vandal and a dropout and a drug addict, and as a teenager, also doesn't really give a shit about protocol. They'll tell you what's on their
Yeah.
mind, and
Yeah.
his stories kind of blew me away. And the thing that was great about his stories is that he came back to ground, and he said, I've found my feet again. And I put him in the art category just because everything he did in his life was, I guess you'd call it artistic, but it was still not clear what he was going to do with himself. But it did seem like he was finished with hurting people, and and putting himself at great risk. So that, compared to like the privileged kids in the advanced school, and some other kids with uh, what you might call burdens or disabilities or obstacles. In spite of that, the way that people spoke really did seem to break down into youth, middle age, and elderhood. And I don't know if it may be cultural. I mean, I guess it probably is. We're all sort of living in the same soup. Um,
Yeah.
but the young people were, open-minded and emotionally vulnerable, just sort of building their membrane, protective membrane. Um, as I said, one woman who was abused as a kid um, was getting over that, but she was in her middle age already. Um, and and other people lived really, really tough lives, lives of poverty. I'm just thinking of one in particular, um, a Hispanic kid who grew up constantly going through foster homes and, single mother family with no relatives and very little income. And his story was great because the profession he took up was graffiti artist, which is like the most ridiculous profession. I mean, you can imagine a teenager doing it, but now he was a sort of professional graffiti artist. And he's all these stories of, he's the only person I've ever known who met those people we've heard of who live in the subway, in the dark tunnels of New York subways.
Yeah.
So he actually found them when he was fleeing from the police. And well, I'd like to know, about their lives. Anyway, so that's the story. And as I said, the one woman who was the gay Black woman said, I wish I learned to love myself sooner. And that's sort of been resonating in my head for, the last decade.
Yeah.
It's a big question. What does that actually mean?
There's definitely an arc there. There's the I don't give a shit, and then you build into this more mature mindset, and then you drop back into the I don't give a shit. Yeah. It's funny how the lifespan really works. When I started talking with people and trying to discover what this is all about, it's a discovery process. I went to the homeless people and I started there, and I really wanted to understand, why are you here? I've been homeless myself, and I know it takes a lot of strength to get yourself back out of that, or you're going to fall into it, stay there, and become nothing, and just be what that tells you are. There is that mindset where I just want to be here. It's easy. There's no checks and balances to it. I really don't have to answer to anything. But when we really get to the bottom of it, there's a lot you answer to in a lot worse ways when you put yourself under those conditions. And the only way we can discover that is through these conversations. And a lot of people don't take that conversation to the homeless population. It's taboo. You're there for a reason. And I really understand, because I've dealt with it all my life, seeing people go through this disparity where you really don't have to be there. Why are you there? And it's one of those things that fascinate me. You are an intelligent, my brother, for instance, very intelligent, but he has this wild streak about him where he's got to chase that thrill. And he's older than me. He's almost in his 70s now, and he's still on that mentality. I often wonder what it takes to break that cycle of thinking. So I see that he understands there's a way out, and he has watched me go through this stage of, you've got to strip that out of your life and try to place yourself where you want to be. Don't place yourself where people or your mind tells you you have to be. There's a big difference. But what is that breakaway point? And I still haven't discovered that myself, even going through the process. I know it's about setting healthy boundaries and having a sense of pride about yourself. How do we put that into people that are down and out, in that homeless category or that rebellious category in the earlier stage of life, usually, but not always? I've witnessed it where it can happen to their death. What's the psychology behind that?
I love the question, because there is no one psychology behind that. I have my psychology, which I'm still working on, and it
Mhm.
breaks down into intellectual pride, emotional pride, and I don't know, spiritual pride. When I say pride, I mean self-confidence or vision. And then there's this social world that we feel ourselves being funneled into, first in our adolescence, and then in our young adulthood. And I have to say, I think the social world is really the most fucked up. It manifests the most conflict. And I mean, I was really disturbed with this war in the Ukraine. I thought kind of war was behind us, that we look at the past wars of hand-to-hand combat,
Yeah.
and the future wars of total annihilation, and we get our shit together and not do that anymore. And here it is flaring up again in a big way. And we can see it's kind of like blowing on the embers. Now we're talking about war with China. People don't really want to talk about it, but it's not far from possibility. And then the world has been full of these little proxy wars, which are really violent and really awful. And if this is what society shows us, teaches us, and asks us to accept, it's not very healthy. And then finally, there's I have to really say, it's been healthy for me to become a therapist, because now I get to talk to other people and say, what the hell? Well, I don't actually, I'm not supposed to ask them to answer my questions. I'm supposed to be there to help them answer their questions. But in the process, I get to see what they think. And the whole thing doesn't work unless everybody's fairly honest. I say fairly because this is like an onion. There's those layers of honesty and truth and reality that you peel back. And the more you peel them back, the more honest they seem to get, but also the less clear they get. You sort of get back to your childhood emotional upbringing, and it's very raw and very strong, but now you're back to where you didn't know what was going on and trying to figure it out again. And then you get to the issue of, how are you going to figure this stuff out? Do you need to go back to the trauma when you were injured or otherwise threatened? Or do you need to let it go and say, it's like if you had abusive parents, do you need to return to the abuse? Or do you need to understand the parents? Or do you just need to realize that they went off on a dead end and you don't want to go down there? That's like, it's their funeral and you don't want to make it your funeral. And that's often what I find myself doing in therapy. It's telling people it's not your problem. It was somebody else's problem, ancestral, cultural, um, a bad a bad hand of cards that somebody was dealt, or otherwise misfortune. And as you were saying, I think, or at least as I was hearing, you have to envision where you want to go and what you want to be outside of what other people are telling you and what you think you've been forced into becoming.
That's
And
right.
until you do that, you're not really free. And even when you do
That's
that,
right.
it's not clear. Now you're like, okay, now I can do anything, maybe. Well, how do I decide? Um, and as I said to you, I love being lost. I mean, this is the thing I think is important.
Yeah.
If you learn to love yourself enough, you can be lost, because you feel you'll
That's right.
always have your positive feeling of yourself no matter where you are. And in that, you can really follow the currents and your emotion, your intuition, your instinct, and get away from what you've been taught and told and how you've been graded and rewarded or punished. And that's the thing I try to do with people. So this is interesting. It takes a slightly different direction, but not really. I find to do that, to get into what's important and intuitive and instinctive, you have to get out of your intellectual mind. I mean, it's not that you discard it and throw it away. It's just that you realize it's just one tool, but maybe not the right one. Doesn't fit all screws and nuts. Um, so I am, and I have always been interested in trance, states of trance, alternate states of perception and reality, appreciation being uh, extreme. And I think you can appreciate that with your story about your brother being extreme emotional states. The key is being able to navigate these states and not to get lost
That's
in
right.
any tributary, but to be able to explore them because they're not irrelevant, even if they're dark and sad. If they're important to you, they've probably got something valuable in them. But if you can't navigate them, you'll get stuck. So I use hypnosis to get people into states of memory, emotion, because hypnosis is reversible. You can go in and you can come out. And as a hypnotherapist, that's what my role is, to help people hold their hand or keep track of how they got in and remind them, because your memory gets all kind of messed up. Memory of the past, the present, you forget things, you lose track of time. And I'm there to take notes. And then you can read the notes afterwards. And then I've been involved, we didn't mention it, but I was involved in mountaineering as a youth. That really got me out of what I considered the unpleasant, affluent childhood. And you can imagine, having money doesn't, my family was well off, but it doesn't solve your childhood questions about being loved and accepted.
That's right.
So I got into mountain climbing because that involved me with people who were really authentic, because you're holding the lifeline literally to other people. And you got to know that they're going to be there when the line gets taut, that they're going to hold you. It's kind of metaphorical, but it's also real. So I appreciated that. And then there's a lot of suffering in that because of the extreme physical exertion you have to put in and the places you find yourself. I would say that I've been thinking about that recently. There was a movie recently called Free Solo, which is about Alex Honnold's ascent of the 3,000-foot cliff El Cap without any rope or protection. And it's a scary kind of movie. And I remember that I did something like that. My cliff was 1,200 feet instead of 3,500 feet, but I didn't have a rope and I was alone. And it was roughly vertical. Anyway, it's hard to recall those things. I'm happy to say I only did it once. And it wasn't foolish in the sense that I was prepared, but I wouldn't do it again. Not only because I have a family, which I do, but because when you're doing something really risky, you can't focus on all the things that might go wrong. You can't look down.
Yeah.
That's almost metaphorical. You shouldn't look down. I mean, you may be pursued by the demons of hell, but don't look down. You look forward.
Yeah.
You look across, and you build your structure. And anyway, it's not a healthy thing to do to climb huge cliffs without a rope by yourself. Anyway, I did it once, and it was very interesting because you get so much focus. You have to focus.
Right.
It's an unreal state of mind. So now when I deal with people in therapy, I have to kind of remind them that everything we do is a somewhat unreal state of mind. We're sort of fabricating what we choose to believe in, and we're either looking down, which maybe we shouldn't, or maybe we're looking too high at things that other people tell us we should be going toward. But that was another thing in my book. A lot of people said, don't focus on what you're told should be your goal. Because even if you're successful and you get there, it's not going to have any meaning if it never had any meaning.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. How much passion did you discover in that process? Because I find that most successful people have a passion about what they're doing, and that really helps you maintain that focus and that direction.
I wouldn't necessarily call it passion as much as necessity. Um,
Hmm.
if you feel you have to do something, it's good to be passionate about it. And if you feel you have to do something and you don't like it, well, then you're in a struggle. So, we hear about, struggling artists. They're not doing it because they're being rewarded. They're doing it because they have to do it. Or, I project, your brother. Why does he continue to do what he's doing? Probably because he feels he has to. Is he passionate? Well, he's certainly involved. Again, I'm projecting,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
um, and I think passion is what you get when you feel like you can't do anything but go forward. And you could either be depressed about it, and some people are. Like I say, as therapy, you deal with people who feel that they can't do anything about what's happening to them, and they're not happy with it, and that makes them depressed. You have to realize sadness is different from depression. Depression is like feeling like shit. Sadness is just regretting that you're in this position. It doesn't mean like you feel terrible in your soul. That's another step. And I talk to people about that. What are you creating here? And how much of it is your creation? What could you do about it? There's a kind of other side to passion, which is sort of inevitability or necessity. So people can feel compelled, even if they're not passionate. They can be resentful or regretful or angry about a situation they feel they have to pursue, or they can feel passionate about it. I do find that most people who would call themselves successful are passionate. They are not, they don't resent, they don't regret. Um, and that's not necessarily true with therapy. Often you get people who are struggling and they're not happy. They're not passionate about their situation. Well, they may be passionate about not their desire not to be in their situation. I mean, the obvious thing is relationships. Relationships are really ambiguous, and you have a lot of passion, but you wish it was working to your advantage, and it's not, or something like that. Um, Sometimes you feel like you have the ability to make choices with your romantic partners, and other times with your family, you don't have choices.
Yeah.
I think passion is really being connected to your emotion. And I don't tell people as a therapist that they should be passionate, but I do tell them that they should be connected to their emotion. Well, should. I try not to tell them that they should be anything, but I try to find out where they're going that's rewarding or will reward them. And it's a combination of being more involved and less involved, more involved with what you want, less involved with what you don't. So I guess, I mean, the question of passion, it kind of dissolves into the question of necessity and opportunity. And the third part is trauma, memory, and experience. I think a lot of people need, and I'm not being God about this, but they seem to need to process their past. It would be valuable, and they seem to be driven toward it, and there seems to be some solution that will come out of it. So, how do you help them with that? Or even can you? And my answer is that you try to be there, not just in the present, but in their world, and say, if I were your brother, or if I were the angel sitting on your shoulder, what would I tell you? What could I tell you? And really, the interesting thing is that the goal of that approach is for them to find the angel sitting on their shoulder, who isn't really
Yeah.
you. And if they find that, I mean, you can imagine if you can get in contact with your spiritual muse or your spiritual guide, You don't need anyone else. No one would be as good as that energy. And
That's right.
and a lot of us don't have that energy. I'm not sure any of us have that energy, all the time.
Right.
I think that's what therapy is. And I don't even like calling it therapy because that makes it sound like you're sick. You're not sick. You're almost transforming. I mean, would you call a snake that was molting an animal that needed therapy? No.
Yeah. Yeah. Lincoln, that's very interesting because there's a whole subset of the population, especially in the homeless area, where they don't have the sense of worth or value, and understanding how to find that is a lost art. Nobody teaches you that, especially when you come from a family set that's destructive by nature. So how do we convince people to connect and understand getting that off of your chest and divulging your inner thoughts can actually help? I found it through podcasting, but understanding releasing that can actually make you say, hey, I'm free from it. I understand it's just a thing. How do we get those people connected to therapy that works?
I think my answer is kind of like your answer. And that answer is through relationship. I've found so here are two examples. I think if you can't make progress, if you can't find answers, if you can't get relief, you often develop physical illness. I'm not exactly sure why, but it seems to be something telling you you've got to break out or you're going to suffer real damage. And maybe that gets people to realize something that they wouldn't otherwise if it was just a concept. So I deal, and I'm always interested to deal with people who have physical problems, physical illness, because all physical illness has some mental aspect to it, even if it's just a broken bone. Why did you break the bone in the first place? And what are you doing to heal it? And what could you do to foster its better healing? And these are mental questions, even though the bone might be a kind of a very practical, mechanical question. But for most people, chronic illness is not even mechanical at all. In fact, it's often not even clear if or what the mechanical problem is, with things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. And it's really interesting to work with those people because they have most of them have a clear point at which they don't want to go. They don't want to, and I'm not generalizing to everybody, but generalizing to my client base, they don't really want to hear that they're responsible for their situation. And I understand that because it feels disempowering. It's like it's your fault. Now you feel guilty. Maybe you felt guilty before. Now you feel more guilty. But the point is that until you do accept some power, you don't have any power to change. You're a victim. And we always hear about how bad it is to be a victim. It's not always so bad. Sometimes it gets you out of being a victim. You have to get into it to get out of it.
Yeah.
So that's one state of mind. And the other is people who I consider psychotic or psychopathic, who just won't see anything wrong with the way they feel and act. And they don't want to talk to you and they don't want to share. And they're just out for personal gain. And we could reward that if it's money and politics and power, or maybe it's antisocial and emotionally violent or exploitative, and then we don't value it. So the whole notion of what's psychopathic and what's laudable is very slippery.
Interesting.
And makes me very kind of upset socially. But as a therapist, you kind of tread the in between. And the question is, well, do you want to redirect somebody so that instead of torturing their employees, they focus on making everybody profitable? Or do you want to focus on like getting past that need to always gain at someone else's expense and, find love in your family? And you ask, how do you do this? Whatever you're doing, I think the answer is always you can't really do it. You can only invite or
Mm.
entice or convince, cajole, sweeten the idea. But the other people, it's like leading a horse, except you have no tether. It's like, how would you lead a horse if you didn't have a string or a rope? You'd like have to convince it to follow you. And now you get to the question, well, do people understand each other? Are you communicating? Do they trust you? And so therapy is mostly about trying to communicate and understand and get trust. And then you feel alliance and you build collegial relationship, and you can start suggesting or creating, visioning, and supporting. And as I mentioned, I try to bring people into a trance state where they can appreciate their different parts, the parts of them that they don't listen to, or that they're ashamed of, or that they feel in combat or uh, antagonistic to let those parts come out. We have this one personality that kind of we are told to maintain and advance, and it often deprecates and disrespects parts of us, certainly certain memories and experiences we've had. I think we could all bring up childhood memories where we felt really put down and disrespected, and we don't go back there, don't want to go back there. um and that's a question. Is there a benefit to going back there? Maybe, maybe not, depends on your approach. um I like doing dream work with people because dreams are great because they're just so chaotic.
Mm.
You can do all you want to make sense of things, but when it comes to a dream, it's just like a core dump of emotions and memories, and try to figure it out or figure something useful out of it is a great exercise. Um, so, for example, you asked me when we started, I don't know if it was recorded, how do I feel today? And I said I felt sad. And part of the reason I was feeling sad was I was thinking about childhood stuff and where I am and where I've not achieved. I was thinking about what I learned about you and your story and this learning project story. And it was kind of making me sad. And that's okay. You have to feel it's okay to enter into weakness. Um, it's like if you want to build strength in a muscle, you have to work on it. If you've got poor lower body strength and great upper body strength, if you only worked on upper body strength, then you'd never get lower body strength. So that's the way I think of it. To be a rounded individual means working on all kinds of strengths. And a lot of them are, I don't know, it's not a simple answer. Some things just don't taste good. But if you don't
Yeah.
try them, you may never learn to like them.
Yeah. I really think there needs to be a lot more individuals that just muster up the strength to go into the homeless areas or areas where these people form. And I think just a good conversation, letting them know it's okay to live. I find that once you connect with people, they will open up. And it's strange, but they won't open up until you connect with them. So there's something about that connection. The human needs a connection, and once it's sparked, it's fascinating what comes out. They will tell you some of the things that you would never have thought an individual would open up about. Honesty, getting that childlike honesty is hard, especially when you've been broken per se in the world. So mental health is very important. It's got a stigma to it, and I find it sometimes very difficult and hard to reach out and ask for a mental health help, because you're going to get that tagged on the record someplace or something like that. We need that gone. We need that sort of thing out of our life where we feel that way. How can we make that happen where people can actually feel like they're not being recorded for some trauma later, because
Well,
that's what it feels like.
let me give you some answers that have crossed my mind. I can't give you solid answers. It's a big question. One of the
Right.
problems I feel is that we've divided the whole process of growth into illness, um, feedback, and entrepreneurship. So you're either
Mm.
one or the other. And if you're an illness, you need a therapist. And if you need feedback, you get a counselor.
Yeah.
And if you're a business person, you're an entrepreneur. But the truth is that everybody's all of those things. And you certainly want to move. So you'd like the person who thinks they're ill to think that they're an entrepreneur, and move their focus toward accomplishment and reward for themselves, at least. But you'd also like the people who are entrepreneurs, these sociopathic politicians, what we seem to catapult into the world. We'd like them to go back and get their shit together, because they're resonating with a lot of sort of antisocial attitudes that they profit from stirring up. And we'd like them to be more like, more saintly and less satanic. And,
Yeah.
and so this division is a problem. And it's not just problem at the way we're thinking, but it's the way people are trained and certified. And unfortunately, there's money. So you're not going to get anybody to spend time with you unless somebody pays them, because it costs money to live. And so the lower income bracket, which would be homeless and whatever, or maybe even average, like you say, one of the reasons that you're reluctant, and most people are reluctant to engage with counseling, is that it costs. You have to overcome, what's it worth to me? Is it $100 a week? Do I really need this? But if you have no money at all, then you're reliant on, basically state services. And those services, I have to say, are not entirely built for you to excel. They're kind of there to contain you, to make you not so much of a problem for other people. I mean, this is the whole thing about mental health. Give them a pill. And people accept that kind of stuff. And I've just been reading this morning that in both depression and schizophrenia, over a period of a few years, people do much better if they don't get on pharmaceuticals than if they do. So the process of working your issues out, 80% of the time gets you out of your depression. And surprisingly to me, returns you to being function if you were schizophrenic. But taking the antipsychotics and antidepressives largely lock you into it. And that's more than just depressing. It's kind of frightening. And I can only think that over time there will be a change, but I'm not sure which change it'll be. So the question is, like, how does a homeless person or anybody who doesn't have the funds get into the system of getting help? And then how do you navigate that system? Because do you want a shrink? Do you want to be told that you have a disease or that you're ill? I don't buy into that.
Point.
And if that's all you're going to get, because that's all the social service therapist offers, you got a different problem on your hands. And I think that's kind of the answer to your question. There's no answer. In the
Yeah.
society we live in, there's something systemic about these problems. Um, they say that 3% unemployment is natural or acceptable. And I have a suspicion that a certain percent of mental illness is also natural and acceptable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
these are just the people who fall along the wayside in the war to greater gross national product.
Yeah, it's an interesting life we're living. And Lincoln, it seems like it gets worse instead of better when we talk about these social services. And it's really up to people to shine light on it. And that's kind of, go ahead.
This is what I'd like to do. I'd like to build our own army of counselors, of regular people who help each other. They don't have to be, if we could make friendship a process of personal growth rather than, just gaining entertainment.
Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of what happened in the COVID experience. A lot of people said they sort of winnowed through their friendship list and said, these people are not my friends because they don't really support me in my struggle. They have an attitude that's contrary to mine. And we kind of got, the pro versus the anti-government story camps. And I know a lot of people whose social circles were fractured along that line. And I'd like to say that in terms of therapy, mental health counseling, and coaching, we have to build our own territory rather than trying to fix it. I'm just not a fix it person. I'm a do it kind of person. So
Yeah.
I tell my clients, we all need to become therapists for each other. And so that we're not charging each other. I mean, I charge because that's my thing, but I'd rather not. I'd rather not charge anybody.
Yeah, I understand that thought. I often wrap my brain around that. How can we get these services where they're free? Just a mentorship or a friendship that is a big turning point in our society, bringing back the connection. The focal point should be on community, because it's not about me, it's not about you, it's about everybody. And what's right for me is not necessarily right for you. And we have that fight, push, pull, tug of war going on, and it's easier than that, but it all boils down to the buck. And that's what we all need to keep going. But when that's truly our only focus, I think it's detrimental in many ways. So finding that freedom and ability to help, it is key to success.
Just to complicate it a little more, it's to learn from indigenous cultures, which I've always been interested in. And what you can learn from indigenous cultures is that the grass isn't always greener on the other side of the fence. So I spent a week with a group of people in the Queen Charlotte Islands called the Haida, and they're one of the older and more warlike Pacific Northwest groups. And I spent the week with a chief. I don't know how many chiefs there are, probably more than one. And he said, in our culture, everybody is in everybody else's business. And this is kind of where we're going when we say, friends should be deeper and friends should be more therapeutically supportive. And you get into these cultures where everybody's in everybody's business. And he says it's hell because nobody leaves you alone. Everybody's got their attitude and they're all telling you what they need and they're all telling you what they want. And to be a chief in his tribe, you have to put a tremendous amount of money into paying everybody else off because you're only voted chief in proportion to how well you support everyone else. And, you got to buy them boats and couches and houses and land. And so that the
Yeah.
chiefs have to be rich because they can't afford, you know. And so it's funny that uh, it's not just this indigenous group, but others as well, where everybody supports everybody else until somebody gets ahead. And then everybody's on their back trying to, trying to piggyback
It's
on their success.
it's the tall poppy syndrome.
And so it's very
Uh,
funny, so we decry our culture where we, extol success and prosperity. And then you look at these cultures where nobody can get ahead because everybody expects you to help everybody else. And in those cultures, there is no poverty, there is no homelessness, there are no orphans. Everybody's taken care of, and everybody's bitchy. Um, and I remember I spent years in the Caribbean, and I would hang out with the locals, and this one guy had a baseball cap that said "Another shitty day in paradise," and and I thought, exactly.
that's the
With the feeling,
summary.
I'm left with the feeling that this is our work. We're not going to get the fountain of youth, the thousand virgins, and angels playing on harps and clouds. This is our work, and
Yeah,
if our culture's fucked up, well, part of our work is to work with our culture. And if we're fucked
that's
up,
right.
well, part of our work is to elevate ourselves. So
That's
you
right.
say enthusiasm and passion. Well, are you passionate for your success? Or are you passionate for your process? And I have to say, I think you have to be passionate for the process, because the more enlightened you
Yeah.
become, the more other people's troubles you find yourself um, considering. And
Yeah,
that has to be a reward. You have to
that's right.
sort of become saintly, which we think is ridiculous, right? We think, Mother Teresa is just a weirdo. We would never want to be that person, work with lepers and, you know, people so down and out. But I think that's your future. If you want to really enlighten yourself, you're going to find yourself working with people who need your help. And that has to become a calling. You
Yeah.
have to get passionate.
I think that's the most important thing we've said all this whole interview, that is true wisdom right there. And when we find that calling and that process, once we determine the process, understand the process, and implement the process, it starts working miracles, as we call them in our life.
I,
The,
I,
you
I
know,
wish
I,
it did. I'm still struggling myself. I think we all do, right?
I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and I deal with that chronic pain syndrome in my muscles all the time. And the more I grow with that and understanding more about it, they say it's a basket case disease and all of that. But truly, what I've identified is when I am super stressed, worrying, and got so much chronic nonsense on my mind, that's when I get flare ups of these muscle things. And it's interesting you stated that our psychological affects our physical. It's so true. I witness it every day and I understand that. So keeping positive and keeping oriented without the stress is truly key. And that's discovering who you truly are and knowing your limits and putting boundary on those limits.
Well, another duality I struggle with is religion. I'm very anti-religious, but then what I mean by that is I'm anti-dogmatic, because
Hmm.
I have to appreciate that some of the most enlightened people are religious, but then they don't mean it in the sense of being pro-dogmatic. They mean it in the sense of being guided by something
Spiritual.
greater.
Yeah.
So, the last thing I'll ever do is pray. Yet at the same time, every time I wake up in the morning, I go through a list of all the people I love. And that's a kind of a prayer. I just won't, I refuse to call it religion.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but there's something about intentionally focusing on what's out of your grasp and what you think
Yes.
is sort of the highest moral ground, which is necessary. Um, I tell my clients sometimes that their work is not just benefiting them. And the reason they have that work is not just for their own benefit, but that all the people who've struggled in their lives or oppressed them or continue to be dysfunctional stand to gain from their progress, even if they're not in contact with those people anymore, even if those people aren't alive anymore. I I,
Mm.
I don't even know how that works, but these connections we have. Uh, like my mother was, I don't know what was wrong with my mother, but she didn't have an ability to be emotionally supportive to me. And so she's been dead 10 years. And she was never supportive of anyone I knew, really. But I mean, I was a kid. I didn't really know what was going on. So I'm still working on that, obviously, looking for support. And, that's my problem. I get involved with the relationships and I ask too much of them. Well, I don't think so, but I guess I do. Or at least I get it. See, this is the problem. I get involved with people like my mother who can't provide for me. And then I ask them to provide for me, which makes complete sense. But it's absolutely a terrible,
Yeah.
Strategy. And I feel that in overcoming that, I will benefit my mother or whatever is left of her in the family lineage or maybe in the society, because I'll be able to see it and support it and appreciate it and advance it, that problem that she had, which I don't understand. It could have been trauma, or it could have been, I don't know what it could have been. It could have been something she inherited because she came from Eastern Europe and there's all kinds of, shit going on in the past of,
Yeah.
Jews and Middle East and God knows what.
Oh yeah.
That
Yeah.
stuff comes down to it. So this is what I say to people. Your work is not just your own. So we talked about
Yeah.
how to lift yourself up and be more available to other people. You could also say that working with other people doesn't just advance them; it advances you. I
That's
think
right.
that's pretty easy to grasp.
Yep. Yeah, I
Anyway,
get that every day.
yeah,
And that's why I like to discuss things with people that actually put mind set to the topic. They actually get into it. They are truly curious and want to discover, is there an answer to all this? And maybe there isn't. Who knows? The point is discovery. Life is never ending process of learning and discovery. And if you grasp that, acknowledge it, it can help quite a bit.
also, the concept of evolution, people think it means progress. Evolution doesn't mean progress. It just means change and reconfiguration toward greater something. Not even balance,
Mm.
right? Because ecologies are not,
Yeah.
they're sort of balanced, but they're very dynamic. So I think in personalities and in cultures and in families, you have to accept that there's a certain evolution that you're a part of. And when you say, I don't know if there's an answer, I can assure you there's no answer. Is there an answer to evolution? Who knows? I mean, if everything stops, then eventually it dies. That's the answer. We're all
Yeah.
dead.
Yeah.
But aside from that, it's just turbulent, somewhat unpredictable, opportunistic, and full of dead ends.
Yeah.
And it's like, where is a tree's branch supposed to grow? No one place. That's why they grow out in all directions.
Yeah.
So, well, I think I want to mention this book so that people can get back to it. My website is mindstrengthbalance.com. And if you go to the learning page, I hope you'll find the book. It takes one more click to get there.
Yep.
And the book is free online, or you can get it No, I didn't make it as an audio book. We can get it as a digital book and a printed book and so forth, but it's free online. And I like the online navigation of it. So
Yes.
mindstrengthbalance.com is where you can find it. Okay.
Well, Lincoln, it's fascinating that we've had this opportunity to talk and discover new things. I really get. I can go on for hours about the human mind and discovery. It's a never-ending process. Do you have a call to action for our listeners today?
I have a free blog that I put out once a month. If you go to the website, one of those pop-ups will appear shortly and ask you to put in your email. And if you do that, you'll have a connection to my work and my thoughts and my books, my games, my therapy, all this stuff. And it's a rich website. I've been writing for years. And I have a bunch of books on sleep and dreams, book on COVID, 3 books on learning, one of which we've talked about. I should mention that after I wrote this book called The Learning Project, which I mentioned was so incomplete, so general and broad, I felt people would benefit from a few nuggets of wisdom that I'd gotten from these interviews. So I wrote 2 more books, which were just bulletin points almost, of what learning and progress consist of. And I thought it would be 1 book, turned out to be 2. But you can find those there under the books tab. If you want answers, that's full of answers, which you'd find interesting too, because we've just talked about how there are no answers. So that's not satisfying often. So there are answers, they're just not
I love it.
final answers,
Yeah, that's right. You must seek to learn, and understanding what you learn, that's a process all of its own. So I love it, what you're doing. And you've got a fascinating website. I've ordered the print book, and now you've enticed me to actually go and order the other 2. So I will be doing that also. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I will share all your links with our folks in the show notes. Have a good day and continue enlightening people about change and life's mysteries.
Thanks, Ed. I really appreciate your help. Anybody who subscribes will be helping too.